You want to put one in?
Good morning, all. Very nice to see you all, and great to be welcoming our guest this morning, Dr. Brian Redmond of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and Case Western. Dr. Redmond is the curator of archaeology at the Museum of Natural History and an anthropology professor at Case Western. He has particular expertise in finding and interpreting evidence of northern Ohio's first human residents. And for our today, we'll be hearing from him about findings pertaining to ceremonial practices at the Heckleman Site in Erie County. So without further ado, Dr. Redmond.
Switch in. We switched over to this mic. I need to turn it up a little. Is that any better? It's a big room. How's that? Yeah. Good? Okay. I'm going to turn it this way a little bit.
It's a handheld if you prefer. It can be held by hand if you prefer.
I might. I like to move around sometimes, but I'll stand still here. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you all. I understand you've had presentations or discussions about ceremonialism and ritual, and I was asked to come and talk a bit about Native Americans in Ohio, in northern Ohio, and something we know from archaeology, what we're learning about people that lived thousands of years in the past, that practice their own types of very complex rituals and ceremonies, some of which you may have heard of in the past. And I'm going to focus in on kind of a case study, a site that I've worked on for almost 10 seasons now, called the Heckleman Site, located in Erie County, Ohio, which is a wonderful, very complex place in terms of what people were doing there in the past, and a lot of it did involve very important ceremonies and rituals, which again, we understand just through the lens of doing archaeology, which is not perfect, but gives us some idea of what was going on that far back in the past. So let me start out by telling you the era that I'm going to be referring to, where a lot of this is going on all across Ohio and the Midwest, is called the Woodland Period, and woodland is just a name that archaeologists apply to this. So you need to understand that we don't have any known tribal identifications for these folks. They were here well before Europeans came with written records. So we call it the prehistoric or the pre-contact time frame in Ohio. So pretty much everything we know about the people that were here before the first people came, the first Europeans came here, let's say in the maybe 1700 at the earliest or so, has to do with what we know from archaeology. And as I said, it's a bit imperfect because our record that we study is pretty sparse and imperfect in different places and for different time periods. But this map, it just kind of shows you a couple of different large archaeological complexes that have names like Hopewell and Adena. Some of you may have heard the Hopewell culture. Basically, the tan area here covers a good part of the eastern woodlands of North America. So from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, and from almost the East Coast out into the plains. And what this represents is probably dozens and dozens of separate tribal or social groups that probably spoke different languages, but interestingly appeared to practice a similar type of ceremonialism. So you think about some of the world religions today, all different countries, but they have similar icons, symbols, artifacts they use in their services and ceremonies that tie them together. But maybe every other aspect of their life, they were doing things related to their region. And that's kind of how the overall culture is looked at. It really isn't one culture. And there is an expression of that in northern Ohio, at the Heckleman Site. I'm not going to say so much about that today, that's a whole other talk. But prior to that was more in the Ohio region, the Ohio Valley, and southern Ohio, into northern Kentucky, is what they call the Adena Culture. And again, this is just a general label for a lot of different societies. But generally, both these things are often thought of simply as kind of the mound-building cultures of Eastern North America. And most of us that went to school in 4th grade, and if you're from Ohio and you were taught Ohio history, hopefully your teacher mentioned the mound builders, a little bit about that. And again, that information comes mostly from archaeology. So what I'm going to talk about is the expression of this, what we call now an early woodland culture, mound building, earthwork building, ceremonial culture, up here in northern Ohio, at this place we call the Heckleman Site. So again, this is located in Erie County, which is in north central Ohio, about 20 miles south of Sandusky or so, on the Huron River, a branch of the Huron River right there, and where the star is. This is a close-up of, or a satellite view of the property. This is actually on a private farm, just west of the little town called Milan, Ohio, birthplace of Thomas Edison, if no other reason to know about it. It's just north of Norwalk, if you know where Norwalk's the bigger town, just south of there. But it's on a private farm, and this area I have outlined here is pretty much where we find artifacts related to these different occupations of the site that go back probably almost 3,000 years ago. And of course, here's the site up here. So, a technique we have available to us now to do work at sites like Heckleman, where a place where we came to back in 2008, 2009, it was a big plowed field, big farm field. And actually archaeologists had worked there before and found artifacts and things, and we knew something about the site from earlier work. But we didn't have much information about where did those people dig and what did they find. So we implemented a couple of what are called geophysical survey techniques using particular specialized instruments like magnetometers to walk over the surface of the site and identify possible what we call features, archaeological features below the ground before digging. It's a great tool to locate things that we're looking for without digging hundreds of holes across the site and just prospecting for something. And so we had a large magnetic survey done at a part of the Heckleman site by this individual, Dr. Jared Burks, who's an expert. And back in 2008, he had one little handheld instrument here, that's a magnetometer. He'd walk back and forth and take readings. And produce a map like you see here, which generally looks like a bunch of dark and light splotches, right? And some of those are just disturbances in the ground. But what really stood out, obviously, now are these dark streaks there, and then this oval shape thing here. Well, that turned out to be, these are ditches. These are ditches dug by the prehistoric people as much as 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, which you can't see on the ground. The ground's been plowed for almost 200 years. There's no earthworks or anything preserved. So right away we got lucky and said, well, here's evidence of this part of the site being occupied. And generally we know from other studies of Adena and Hopewell archaeology in southern Ohio that those people built ditches and then piled up earthen walls along them. And most of those enclose ceremonial or sacred space. They're not defensive structures. They are enclosures, sacred enclosures of one type or another.
How deep does the magnetic instrument that your friend is carrying, how deep does it go?
No more than about 3 feet deep, about a meter.
How?
About 3 feet, a meter. And that's pretty much deep enough for us to identify what we're looking for. Most of the archaeological remains in much of North America are not more than about 3 or 4 feet deep, with some exceptions, but they're not too deep. So what you see here are the magnetic anomalies that represent real things under the ground, and that's what we basically spent about 9 more seasons checking them out through archaeological survey every summer. And that just shows you where these ditches are. And I'm going to focus most of my talk on the work we did in and around this oval enclosure here, because this is very unusual. Well, previously undiscovered in northern Ohio. They do have things like this in southern Ohio, more on Hopewell type sites. But this is about, a third of an acre, to give you an idea of the scale here. So it's relatively large for northern Ohio earthworks. And then this is a plan just showing this part of the site through 2013, where we did most of our work in this part or eastern part of the site. So these represent a combination of all different excavation units and trenches that we dug every summer. And you put all the information together. And all these circles and dots and all this in here are what we call features. These are prehistoric or pre-contact Native American cooking pits, storage pits, deposits of artifacts, and in some cases we found small little stains in the ground that represent the wall posts of up to all sorts of houses. And there's a lot going on here. In fact, we determined eventually there were 4 different major occupations at this site. As early as about 300 BC, which I'm going to be talking about today, as late as about 1400 AD, right? So about 600 years ago or so, just before Europeans came to the area. And what makes it really a tough job is all these are one on top of the other, and they're not separated stratigraphically because the plow has gone through and just mixed everything up. But when we get below what we call the plow zone, the top 8 to 10 inches of soil, we can see undisturbed features, pits, post molds, things like that, and then try to sort it out by time and function and all those types of things. So there's a lot going on here that isn't representing what I'm going to talk about today.
Question?
And then to the west, we excavated where those 2 linear features were, those 2 dark stains, these parallel streaks on the last map, digging excavation units, and everything in red represents these 2 earthen ditches.
Question?
Yeah.
If it was just earth being moved, why would it have any magnetic signature?
Why would it have magnetic signature? Because what this instrument picks up is any change in the natural magnetic field in the ground. So anytime you dig a hole, dig up soil, put that soil or another soil back in, it changes really the polarity, negative and positive, of the particles, particularly the iron particles in the soil. So we call it an anomaly. It's a disturbance of the soil. It also could be a piece of a tractor that fell off, 10 years ago. Any metal that's going to pick up, those are very strong signals that we can kind of weed out what we're looking for.
Thank you.
But I'm glad you asked that because that's what it's actually picking up, is that disturbance in the soil. And then in the green, this is where we excavated part of this oval enclosure. You see, we didn't get all of it. The magnetic map showed it went around pretty much like this. And this is about 8 seasons of excavation here by our museum, and also we work with the University of Toledo, Dr. David Stuthers, and an amateur nonprofit group I work with called Firelands Archaeology, which is based out in Sheffield Village, Ohio. Lots of good volunteers. So what I'm going to talk about is pretty much that area around that oval enclosure, that large block area I just showed you. And we did excavate, first season we excavated where the oval ditch was supposed to be, and we found it, thanks to the magnetic survey. And this is just a cross-section of it. So we find these features, we mapped them in plan, and they're usually oval pits, things like that, and then long, dark, linear stains, which represent the filled ditches. So remember, all these have been backfilled in the past, and they have artifacts in them that tell us about the age and maybe what people were doing there. But what you're seeing here is a vertical cut, a section through the ditch. And it's basically about a meter or 3 feet or so below the surface, and about a meter, 3 feet or so across here. It probably expanded out and one time went just about to the modern surface. But all this dark band is the plow zone. This is all disturbed soil that has artifacts in it, but doesn't leave things in their original place. And for archaeology, the original or undisturbed context is really the most important thing. It had a lot of artifacts in it, including this piece of an early woodland vessel. This is the side, a little bit of the flat bottom of a pot that was some of the earliest pottery in Ohio. Think of like a crock pot shaped vessel. That's kind of what this looked like originally. And here's one of our volunteers digging a section out of the fill, the dark fill of this ditch. So it told us something about the age. It told us based on the artifacts and then some charcoal that we did some radiocarbon dating on that dates to around, I think this occupation is about 300 BC, so about 2,300 years ago, roughly, is when people first came to this site, started building enclosures, and I think practicing some really interesting ceremonialism. There are a couple mounds on the site. Most of our sites in Northern Ohio have been heavily plowed. If there were mounds, they're usually plowed down almost to nothing. But this is one here. It's only 1 foot to 2 feet high. It's kind of outlined for you right there. It's been graded over the years, but it still exists. We've never excavated that. The landowner, the farmer, remembers when he was a young boy, and there was a large tree growing on this that blew over in a storm. He found artifacts in the hole and some human remains. So we think it probably was some kind of burial mound, but we don't know anything about the age or anything like that. But here's kind of a schematic view of the site. I've been talking about, here's the open enclosure, here's the 2 linear ditches, there's the mound I just showed you, and then there's another mound across this creek ravine. Then the Huron River is down here. So this is about 7 or 8 miles up the Huron River from Lake Erie, to give you just some idea of the placement of it. And it's sitting on this high bluff top, this dissected bluff top with riverine, creek riverines on the north, the east, and then the drop off here to the floodplain of the Huron River. So we found a lot of pit features that date to this early woodland period. We found lots of post molds that represent some kind of structures, but it was hard to make out the outline of these walls of these structures. But what we found of particular interest were, there we go. This is called a post mold. This dark stain, and remember this is a vertical cut, this is a vertical section through a round stain on the surface. They go rather deep, and it's about 1/2 meter across, 1.5 feet or so across maybe. And it represents where a large post was set in the ground. And probably a post about, that big in diameter, at least. And we found a number of these, and they didn't hook up with other posts that made a wall line or anything like that, any kind of structure. They seem to be kind of isolated individual posts. Then we found a little different version of the post mold, which really surprised me. I never found anything like this in the region. This started out as a big, so again, we're looking down into an excavated post mold. So we're looking down into a hole, which at the top level was a big round basin, about almost 1 meter or more across. And it went down, so you go down the sidewall, and here's the flat bottom. Again, the fill's been taken out. But at the bottom, we found another round stain. We excavated that down to a little bit, about 1 meter deep. And again, this one was about that big a diameter. Okay. So that was interesting. There was pottery in the basin at the top. There were stone tool remains, pieces of flint material, some animal bone from what they hunted. And there was this projectile point. It's a complete spear tip probably that was found sitting right on the bottom of this post mold. Complete, undamaged. It was about that big.
Wow.
A few inches big. And I thought, that's really weird. This was the only unbroken artifact we found in this whole feature. And I think basically it was put in there deliberately, either when the post was set in or when there's evidence that they actually pulled these posts out later. In fact, in some of these, and I call these post pits, but some of these post pits you actually can kind of see it in the slide, the sidewall, this is where it kind of inclines up this way towards the edge. And I think that's where they either set the post in at an angle and it slid down, or they pulled it out. And that kind of behavior of setting up large posts is really common in southern Ohio, in Adena sites and in Heckleman sites at this same era. So, and I think this is probably an offering, something that was actually put in there deliberately. As a dedication, something like that. So right away we kind of knew that there was something more than just everyday living going on at this site. And this is a map showing you just the early woodland features. Mostly these are the large post molds like the one I just showed you. Okay, and then the ones with the circles around them are the post pits. These are these big ones where they dug a basin either to put the post in or to dig it back out again. And it's turned out, they seem, at least to me, they seem to be clustered. These are all large posts and has one post pit associated with it. And there's a group here, there's a group here, there's a group here. And this may represent separate acts of ceremonialism within, and remember, this is all in that open enclosure area, okay, in this sacred space. And so this may be like one event where they set up a large post, or maybe several at one time, or maybe slightly different times. And it seems like these posts are kind of the center of the ceremonies. They're the focal point at one time of what they're doing. And I'll get back to this in a little bit. So what we're seeing is some really distinct pole ceremonialism, and it's something we see all around the world. Pre-contact cultures around the world, from Japan, from the Pacific, from the northwest coast of North America. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these types of things. And, the posts we're looking at, of course, are gone, but they could have been carved like these northwest coast type things, engraved like these, or just a plain post, probably were painted, something like that. But of course, none of the wood's preserved. We don't have that. In fact, they might have taken the post out in some cases. Now, that pole ceremonialism is a very distinct type of thing that people do, again, around the world, but at certain time frames. And it has to do, in this case, with what I believe is kind of traditional Native American beliefs, really all over North America and beyond, about the nature of their cosmos, their universe, their world. And many groups, most groups traditionally saw the world as a tiered, multi-level places of existence, okay? This is a drawing that was done by an archaeologist who was kind of trying to illustrate some of these cosmologies, beliefs that a lot of Native Americans have, which I think we can project back into the past as an analogy to understand things like what we're finding at Heckleman. So basically what you have is this drawing of the three levels. So the upper world is up here. This would be the sky world, the world above us. The earth world where we are, where people live. Then the underworld, which sometimes is a place of water, or sometimes just a place underground. And many groups believe of a sacred tree or a sacred pole that connects, think about it connecting all three of these worlds. All right? When you dig a post hole, you're digging down into the underworld, right? You're setting your post down in there. And in one case, they actually put an offering. Maybe that was for the spirits of the underworld because they're disturbing that realm, that sphere, and put that little spear point in there. And the post, again, a pole or post, would connect these worlds together. Below to the underworld, on the earth world, and then up into the sky world, extending up. So keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to this in a little bit here. So yeah, again, many cultures talk about the axis mundi, basically the pole that connects the different realms of the cosmos. And that's probably what we're looking at here at Heckleman in a small scale, where for separate ceremonial events that focused around those poles. Sometimes these are represented in artifacts, in symbolism, iconography. This is just an example of this is a shell gorget. This was a type of ceremonial ornament or object that was made out of marine shell. It was carved with different types of symbols during what's called the Mississippian period, which would be some of the last prehistoric cultures before Europeans came, primarily in the Mississippi Valley and into the southeast. And some of the shells, other types of shell artifacts have engravings, and this is an example of two dancers dancing around what they call the strike pole. Just an example of more recent examples of Native people using these poles in ceremonies. This gorget caught my eye because it has the strike pole on it. It also has these birds that kind of look like turkeys, but I don't think they were meant to be turkeys per se. They have these fantails with feathers. And I think and some accounts indicate that these are probably some upper world spirit birds, okay, that flew up and they may have been modeled after turkeys, but they kind of look like that. This is actually called a turkey cock gorget. That's just the name that archaeologists give this symbol. So I saw that, and that's interesting. And it caught my eye because back in 2010, we did some excavation in one area of Heckleman, in this area we've been talking about. And we found this pit feature. This is an example of one of our pit features we find. It's been cut in half, and we've taken this half down. So again, you're looking down at a half excavated pit. And we found not much in there, lots of charcoal. All that black was charcoal soil, and some different rocks, mostly burned rocks from fires and things like that. We did find one little pebble, this pebble here, which pretty much as we excavated it, took it back to the lab and washed it, didn't look like much of anything but a pebble. I almost told the volunteers originally to throw it away because it looked like just a natural rock. But I came back to the lab on a Sunday. What I was doing is every week we'd work in the field, I'd bring stuff back, and then they would wash it over the next week, and then I'd come back the next Sunday and pick it up and look at it. And I looked at the tray rack where all these artifacts were drying. And I saw this, and I said, this has something on it. This has engraving on it. And I've redrawn that here. I thought, what does that look like?
Tail.
I thought, it kind of looks like feathers.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of looks like those feathers.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Maybe not. I had a student that thought that looks like a buckeye leaf, but I think there's too many leaves there. But there's other interpretations of everything I'm saying. My conclusions are based on the evidence we found today, okay? But I think it has at least some of the analogies might be sound. So is this basically something representing the upper world, the birds of the upper world, something like that? It was, again, not just thrown away casually, it was buried in this pit with pretty much natural objects that might have had the remains of a hearth or something used in a ceremony. Really don't know. But that may be evidence of what, this three-dimensional view of the cosmos. And then in the same area, I look up to the north of this excavation. There's a number of little pit features that aren't post holes. And so it's labeled here as a north cluster pits. And those were interesting too because they weren't big posts and they weren't just ordinary pit features. They had lots of pottery in them. And these were not big pits. These were about that big across and maybe that deep. And a number of them up there on that north edge. And you can see here, this is a bunch of pieces or sherds of a crushed pottery vessel that look like that when partly reconstructed. This is a really typical early woodland vessel with this kind of elongated, almost crock pot shape. As usual, we don't have all of it. We have a bunch of pieces that go back from the top almost to the base, not quite, with this basically just cord impressions on the exterior of the pot. This was done before the pot was fired. But most of these little pits have a fair amount of pottery that represents probably one or two crushed vessels. And I wondered, what is that representing there? Because there wasn't much else in there. All that was in there was pottery and then burned rock, what we call fire-cracked rock, which are used in earth ovens and big cooking features. There weren't many other kinds of artifacts, spear points, things like that. There were these burned rocks and small little vessels. And I wondered, are these representing the remains of cooking and communal meals, where they're cooking, and there's ethnographic historic accounts that kind of model this as well, where they're performing ceremonies at this site, they're cooking large amounts of food, and then they're cooking it in pots or serving it in these smaller vessels. And as we see in cultures around the world even today, once that's concluded, the dishware, if you will, is being destroyed. It's being broken and buried in the ground. It's not being used again, because perhaps it was a sacred type of ceremony that involved cooking and eating. And I think we're all kind of familiar with that idea of sacred food, right? That type of thing. So I think that may be what it is. And it is, again, just adjacent to where all these posts represent where little small localized ceremonies went on inside this whole enclosure. So what are we looking at here in Heckleman? Okay, this is the area. I see it more now as a kind of a ritual or a ceremonial landscape. This is a place that was picked for a particular location. I'm not sure exactly why just that bluff top was picked. Where people came and didn't do a lot of everyday living. We didn't find a lot of evidence of house structures, storage pits, the kind of things you'd find where people were building a little village or something like that. It appears to be that they're coming there and doing something special, maybe several times a year, which doesn't leave a lot behind except a little bit of cooking evidence, erection and taking down of large posts and things like that. Maybe comparable to a Native American powwow. If you've ever been to a powwow, there's a picture of one here. Interestingly, they make a little dance ground area, which is a circle. They cook food, they serve food, right, for these special ceremonies and gatherings. And again, this was probably social gatherings too. not maybe just spiritualism, but that was all wrapped together in their culture. They didn't separate out the sacred from the profane, and the sacred from the everyday activities. And then finally, to think about what all this may represent in a bigger way, there's a couple ways to look at this. So one is to look at it again in kind of a two-dimensional look. And what you're looking at here is what's called a LiDAR map. This just shows a very fine-grained view of the topography. So again, you can see that these earthworks are built on top of this high bluff top overlooking the Huron River. But what's interesting about this location, that it is actually surrounded by water. Okay? In fact, 2,000 years ago, it may be that the Huron River was actually at the base of this bluff. And it's kind of moved out this way over time. But there were creek ravines that ran all year round through here, here, and here. Only the third side was open, but what we have is the building of two linear ditches, which very likely in the spring filled up with water when it rained. And they were kind of symbolic water ditches, things like that. And among, again, many Native American traditional cultures, you find what are called spirit barriers, that some groups believe that spirits could not cross over water. So it could be, they may pick this place because it had water surrounding it symbolically, and it may represent a place where either something very important was going on inside that may be involved communicating with some spirits, and either you don't want that to get out, or you didn't want some malevolent type force coming in from the outside. So it'd be kind of a symbolic enclosure in a bigger sense than just this. It also could be, this relates to creation stories among many traditional North American groups that represent what's called the earth diver myth, the idea of the island earth, the idea that the earth was created on the back of a turtle or some aquatic animal by sending some creature down and digging up mud and bringing it up and putting it on the turtle's back. And those stories aren't just confined to the North or South America, they actually are in the northern hemisphere across into Eurasia. Those are traditional beliefs about the earth diver and the building up of the earth itself and the people being created on that surface. So what we may be seeing is that perhaps this also represents, let's say the earth area in the oval enclosure, these water barriers representing even the Huron River on one side, enclosing sacred space in a symbolic way. So we're back, and then if we look at it again in the three dimensions, let's move it to north, south, or the vertical axis with this idea in mind. Could it be that what's going on at the Heckleman Site is they're using the entire landscape and looking at it in three dimensions? So again, here's the bluff top, here's the earthworks, here's the mounds. With the sky world above, the earth world where the activity was going on, and then the underworld of the water world being like the Huron River or the creeks around it that were surrounding it, as a way to represent in the landform, the natural landscape of the axis mundi, or the three-dimensional earth itself. So that's one interpretation. Others might come up with other ideas, but this is a way we're trying to look at this possibly through the eyes of the folks that made these and use these probably for several centuries, about 300 to 500 BC. Thank you very much. Questions?
I do have a question. So having been to the area where the Lascaux caves are and learning that repeatedly they return to those sites to continue the art, at least that would be one of the theories, correct?
Oh, and you mean in southern France?
Yes.
The cave place, the lake, placing cave paintings.
Yeah, and I'm on, so my question really is, how many times do you think people came here? Is this part of what you understand when you look at the ceremonial sites? And did you not say this had been returned to over time?
Yes, that's just, we say it's been returned to multiple times because of the number of features, the number of posts. They all represent one visit to the site, although archaeology can't tell us precisely how many times they came. It could be for generations. But we do know that in terms of just dating this particular occupation, the radiocarbon dates are not super precise, but they cover about a 2 or 3 century interval of time. So think about it. They could have been two centuries that groups came back here to really to worship, to carry out ceremonies. Maybe not every year. Maybe they went another year, they went somewhere else. but they did come back enough that they have these remains preserved. So it could be as much as a couple centuries, it could be maybe just 3 or 4 generations, but I think it's a bit more than that.
And then the second part of that question would be, so you speculate, as you were telling us, that the water, the way the earth, it's conformed, has a lot to do with why that would be a ceremonial site.
Yeah, I think that's one possibility why there, because landforms like that exist up and down the river. And they have later sites and large lake villages and things on them. So it's that's part of it because of the landform and the position of it. There's more to it, and I have a couple of things I won't get into now. I think there's other reasons why they're there. But it's really hard to decide, why did they pick that place?
Yeah.
And keep coming back to that place. And maybe it was just local myths and traditional stories about what may have happened there in the distant past that we can never really know. But that was an important place for them. Yes.
You have knowledge of them being posts, and then of course they were probably wood or something that you don't have any evidence of any posts that were used. And you said
No.
they might have been pulled out and used again.
The posts themselves, no, we do. Some of the post holes have a fair amount of charcoal in them. One way to sometimes among Native societies, more when they're building houses and things, they would char the base of the post to keep it from rotting in the ground. And then that would be charcoal. The wood, unburned wood would rot away, but we would find a cluster of charcoal. Some of our posts had some charcoal in it, which might represent the post, but I think at least the large ones in those post pits were pulled and maybe only used one time and taken away. I'll take the back there.
Did the first Europeans to come into Ohio, which I assume was the British and the French, did they record any of the religious practices of the people they found? And would you have any reason to suspect those practices would have remained essentially unchanged since during the period that you were excavating for?
So when Europeans came, they didn't.
Repeat his question, please.
Yeah, he asked if the Europeans came, did they find any accounts of these people or any records of these people or oral traditions among the native people living in Ohio? So we're talking the 1700s, really, when this would have been. Generally, no, but the other thing is most of the groups that they encountered were named tribal groups, like the Wyandotte, the Iowa, the Miami, the Seneca, and others, who, and based on another whole slew of archaeological and historical evidence I won't get into now, we don't believe those folks are direct descendants of these people. What we know best, as we believe, is that these indigenous people of North America, well, of Ohio at least, left Ohio before Europeans came, almost a century before. Ohio was almost abandoned. So we don't see a direct connection. So they might have met Wyandotte people and asked them, but most of when they do record that they ask these native people questions that they encountered, the answer is, those are the old people. We don't know who they were. They're gone. They're long gone. You know, there was no real connection through oral tradition or anything like that. I wish there was, but there isn't. Yes, sir.
In northern climates, from Norway through Iceland, there's configurations where there is symmetric circles, Stonehenge being the most famous. In here, you're describing randomness of these holes. Do you make any connection to the thoughts that they might have had in terms of why it's random rather than in some systematic fashion?
Well, I don't think it is random. As I pointed out, I think the map I showed of the dots representing the large posts, those each individually they seem to be somewhat random, but they appear to be clustered together. So if you look at the clusters, there's definite patterns to that. And remember, they're in an oval ditch. They're actually enclosing it in a very symmetrical form, like you see in the Neolithic sites in Western Europe and what you're talking about, henges and things like that, a similar type of thing. And to southern Ohio, they made a lot of circles. They made circles with ditches around that look very much like the henges in Western Europe and things like that. So I don't see it as, I don't think it's random. I think it's deliberate. I think it's planned.
But it's not as in the European related to like a sundial structure.
Oh, you mean like alignments?
Yeah, alignment.
There may be alignments at this site that I've kind of have some evidence of, but there's actually among Hopewell societies in southern Ohio, with larger sites, there's lots of solstice alignments, things like that. They are using those types of alignments as sacred directions and where they orient their earthworks.
Yeah, the Marietta site is very much aligned.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but you're not seeing anything here
He
in
said-
such alignment.
There's a couple possible solstice alignments, but it's very hard to make out unless you have them. See, in southern Ohio, they still have intact above-ground earthworks, so you can measure and you can look for alignments. You see what we have, and it's very hard to make some of those. But I think they were conscious of that, I think they were aware of that, and there may have been alignments of some of these posts. If we could separate each one out by time, and what was there, what wasn't there. As a group, it does look kind of like a mass of things. But there is a lot of patterning in that, I think. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for a fascinating talk.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this shape, this circle, and you talked about the sphere also, of representing the cosmos, the model of the cosmos. But the circle is the shape that we see not only in North America, but in Europe. My class is, so I think, the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. Do you have any evidence here in Ohio of a theatrical area around these circles?
I'm sorry, the what area?
Where people have to watch, where you get any sign of audience.
Oh, you mean like an amphitheater?
Yeah, theater.
No, we don't, but I wouldn't expect to see much trace of that. Now, speaking of circles, one thing I didn't mention, but, you see that? I didn't talk about that, but that's actually a wooden post circle that we found after we were working over here, which I haven't really published much on yet. It's about 60 feet in diameter. It was made of, again, large posts that were put in a near perfect circle with a large center post in it. And I think that's something that maybe is analogous to, if you've heard of on the plains, the Sundance circles that historic groups built and carried out ceremonies within them. So they were making circles. And there are circular earthworks, again, just to the south of this. But I don't see any evidence if, again, if you use the analogy of historic accounts, the participants or the visitors were inside the circle around the edges, the perimeter of it.
No evidence of people watching. People are outside the circle.
No, but what would that evidence be if it was there? There's no stone construction, there's nothing that, if they had wooden benches, those wouldn't be preserved unless they were carbonized or burned, so.
No post holes around.
Scattered, but nothing that looks like formal structures as well. If anything, I think they would have been inside, again, around the circumference of the perimeter of it. But again, archaeology unfortunately can't tell us everything. Or I got a job, I guess.
I got a question. You made reference earlier to the early European who had encounters with the Native Americans at that time. So that would have been French or English. Now, did any of them have the ability to, in some fashion, to interpreters or otherwise, question, discuss, interpret what they were being told? But you made reference to, oh, the old people are gone and all that. In terms of that, the history of the area and any religious practices, is there any evidence that had been committed to writing by the Europeans that would describe any of these practices and beliefs of those people? Because 18th century wasn't that long ago. And no, I understand all that, but they said he had contact with. Was there any conversations of that nature that were then committed to writing or historical analysis?
It depends, well, generally in this region of northern Ohio I'm talking about, there are accounts that talk about setting up posts, sacred poles within a circular enclosure. So yeah, there are things that hint at what I'm seeing archaeologically, but it's not detailed, it's rather general. But they were using poles, they were setting up poles very almost opportunistically when they wanted to perform a dance ceremony or something like that. And that is recorded in some of these really historic documents. Yes, ma'am.
Is there still an archaeological society that meets at the museum? And what do they, is that too technical for most people, or what do they do?
You're talking about like volunteer groups or?
No, there was a group at the,
There is no longer at the museum per se, right? Yeah. But I work with a group of Firelands Archaeology, which is located out more in this area. And most of my field crew are volunteer people of all different backgrounds and ages that belong to the group. It's a nonprofit group that we work with. It's just avocational people, amateur people, everyday public that are interested in archaeology and want to do outreach and help excavate, things like that. But that's not in Cleveland, unfortunately. All right, I'll stick around a few minutes if anyone has any other questions.
Thank you, Dr. Redmond. Thank you for your attention, for your great questions. As Dr. Redmond indicated, he's available for additional questions, but we will formally conclude now. Thank you.
Thank you.